and Khaja Nasruddin Tusi, and if they display an inclination towards mysticism, they will often be told to study Mulla Sadra before turning to theoretical mysticism, because Mulla Sadra provides a rational framework in which to understand theoretical mysticism within the confines of Shiite orthodoxy. What happens is that you find there's this tendency to describe the concept of God as you move towards this philosophical interpretations of God with ever greater emphasis on existence. So, for Ibn Sina, God is wajib al-wujud, that which, with respect to its existence, is necessary. By the time you come to Mulla Sadra, God is wujud, the essence of wujud, God, or pure existence. And this is where, once again, we find accusations of pantheism being made, because people say, if God, what's existence? Existence is all of this stuff, right? So then if God is existence, that means God is all of this stuff. That's what? This is God? It's stuff for Allah. It can't be right. So this is where these kind of discussions and doubts about pantheism oftentimes occur in Shiite philosophical tradition. And the answer that you find is that, the short answer, is that by existence is not meant this existing thing. Instead, what's meant is that pure existence, the essence of existence, pure existence completely unadulterated by anything else, this is God. Now, there's an interesting discussion of this, which you find in terms of these degrees of existence. Mulla Sadra said that existence comes in degrees. So, if God is pure existence, but existence comes in degrees, does that mean that God is like the top degree? So we have all these different degrees of existence. When we get to the top one, that's God. But then what about the other degrees of existence? Those are other things than God? And then sometimes this is put in the solution to this kind of problem is put in a paradoxical way, is that when you get to the top degree, it includes all the other degrees. Usually this is explained by an analogy with light. So it's said that pure light can be found in different degrees. So it's not like we have pure light and then we have the adulterated light or the weak light, and these are two different kinds of lights. There's just light. But the light as it's perceived by people can either be pure or impure. So this is one of the ways in which this discussion of the nature of God is developed in philosophical tradition. Now, as is clear, once you start looking at Mulla Sadra's idea of the nature of existence, it's clear that God that there is a strong influence of the Irfani and Sufi traditions on the thinking of Mulla Sadra. Mysticism or Irfan is studied in the seminaries and universities of Iran to a much greater extent proportionately than it is in Europe and the United States. It's divided into theoretical mysticism and practical mysticism. What's studied in the universities is usually confined to theoretical mysticism, although practical mysticism is also studied academically. Practical mysticism is sometimes called Sufism or Tasawwuf, although the term Sufism is used in other senses as well. Practical mysticism consists in the methods developed by the mystics of Islam or the Sufis for the purpose of approaching God. And there are different ideas about what the valid ones are. Under the heading of practical mysticism, one also studies the successive stations or states of the wayfarer on the journey to God. Theoretical mysticism, on the other hand, is a doctrinal system based on religious texts, a tradition of personal religious experiences, and the use of reason. The main current in this tradition stems from Ibn Arabi and continues a long line of scholars and mystics. And I say it stems from Ibn Arabi, but it doesn't mean that everything in Ibn Arabi is taken without qualification. A good example of how this mystical tradition is developed in the Shiite world is the book Hidden Words, or Kalamat-i Maknuneh, from Mohsen Faiz Kashani. There we find the following. He says, "I will speak a few choice words to the core of the matter. It is being, which is both a being and the maker of being. From this, the mystery of the association of haq with things is revealed, because nothing can be without being. And from this it is also revealed that being is the necessary existent, the wajib al-wujud, and is subsistent by his own essence, and is determinate by his own essence. For if he were contingent or subsistent by any other, or determinate by any other, he would be in need of another. And other than being, everything whatsoever is in need of being. Hence it would be necessary for a thing to be prior to itself. Hence everything but being subsists by being, and being does not subsist by anything. Hence being, which is haq himself, is the proof of haq. As the commander of the faithful, alayhi salam, has said, he indicates his essence by his essence." Now here we also find this issue of pantheism coming up, and I want to get back to the difference between pantheism and panentheism as it developed in the Western tradition. I mentioned before that pantheism, nobody calls himself, I'm hesitant. I mean, there's Michael Levine calls himself a pantheist, but aside from Michael Levine, nobody calls themselves a pantheist. But there's a number of Western scholars who are willing to call themselves panentheists. Now, this term panentheism was coined by Charles Hartshorne, who introduced the term in order to distinguish it from pantheism. And the idea that was given was that in pantheism there's an identification of nature or the world with God. Now, Hartshorne wanted to say that the world or God is not to be identified with God. The natural world is not to be identified with God, but rather that the natural world is somehow within God. But then the question comes of how something can be within God if God has no parts. And this has led panentheists on the whole to deny many of the traditional attributes that have been ascribed to God. So most prominently, panentheists, one of the most prominent now in working in the United States is Philip Clayton. And Clayton, along with several other people who call themselves panentheists, claim that God changes through time. So this you find a kind of process theology associated with panentheism. And so neither panentheism nor pantheism can be found in the Shiite traditions that I've been discussing, not in Shiite theology, certainly not in the sources, not in theology, not in the later developments of Kalam, or the traditions of narrations, and not in the philosophical or Irfani traditions either. So it's a mistake to say that, as you'll read it all the time, that, in Islamic mysticism is all pantheist or panentheist or something like this. This is a mistake, because there's never any attempt to say that God and nature are the same thing. Nature becomes, according to the mystical tradition from Ibn Arabi, the manifestation of God, but not God. It's a manifestation. Manifestation is different from God himself. So everything that you find, all creatures, everything that has existence, it all goes back to only the divine existence. Nothing has its own separate existence. And Mullah Sadr puts this in a very paradoxical way through a discussion of causality. When Mullah Sadr wants to explain the nature of God and God's relation to the world, he draws on the Irfani tradition to say that the world is a manifestation of God, but God causes this manifestation. So then this leads people to say, well, then we really have two independent existences: the existence of God, the existence of the world, and they have a relation of manifestation between them. Mullah Sadr tries to block this move by saying that the relation of God to the world is one in which the effect, the world itself, becomes the relation itself. So we don't have a situation in which there's two things that have existence and a relation that connects these two existences. Instead, there's the emanation or a fusion of the world through manifestation, and it's that emanation itself that becomes the world through God's own existence, not through a separate existence. So this is very much different from what you find both in pantheism and in panentheism. So all of the people who are writing in this tradition, from Sheikh Saduk through Khaja Nasruddin Tusi and the Muslim philosophers and many of the Urafa, all of them are going to some pains to deny the idea that everything is God, although from time to time you find some Arif making weird claims like Ana al-Haq or something like this, So we had this case of Halaj, which, Halaj said that, he came to this state in which he realized that his own existence was not, he didn't have any own existence. It's only God. So he said, I am God. And then he was killed for that, But when he was tried, they said to him, why did you say, I'm God? That's blasphemy. And he said, I didn't say it, God said it. So, and these kind of stories about these paradoxical statements that occur from examination of the nature of being are also commonly reviewed and studied in the Shiite tradition. We have 10 minutes. I'll leave this for questions.
I have two questions. First is directly connected with your lecture. So if we accept from the sayings of Imams alayhim salam or from the concept of Tawheed elaborated by Mullah Sadr, I would like to know your explanation of the doctrine of Suhrawardi and your estimation, because we know that all philosophers somehow based their doctrines on the Holy Quran. And for example, Suhrawardi says that Allahu nurus samawati wal ard. and that evil is not essential, it's just the lack of light. Isn't there a kind of contradiction? Because if the essence of God is light, but we cannot, according to Ahadith, we cannot know His essence, we can just know His signs, His immanent aspect. Isn't there any contradiction that the lack of light, it turns that the lack of light is the lack of God? And the second question is about rational and irrational tendencies in the history of Islamic jurisprudence, not jurisprudence itself, but ilm al-usul. So we often face some statements of those people who do not belong themselves to Shia tradition that Akhbari Shiism is just authentic and Usuli Shiism is modern. But as we see, great scholars such as maybe compilators of ahadith books, such as you mentioned Sheikh Saduq and Sheikh Tusi and Sheikh Mufid, were using rational methods. And how do you think, was the struggle between Usuli and Akhbari school, was the winning of the Usuli school a return to some fundamental aspects of Shia thought? Or we cannot say that there is some orthodoxal trend in Shia theology, and these were just two dimensions which both can have its proof in Shia tradition.
All right. With regard to the first question about contradictions, within the philosophical and Irfani traditions of the Shia, I mean, the whole tradition is one that's trying to view these apparent contradictions as paradoxes, not contradictions. So it's, you can multiply these things a lot and find paradoxes, things that seem, it looks on the face of it that there's a contradiction. But I'll tell you a hint. Any time in philosophy or theology you face a contradiction, it's because you have two terms that seem to, one is affirmed of a thing and one is denied of a thing at the same time. And the way to get around contradictions is to distinguish different senses. This is always what's done. And you can find this in the philosophical and Irfani tradition as well. So in the book that I mentioned of Faiz Kashani, for example, is called Kalimat Maknune. It means hidden words. And the book is divided into 100 chapters. And each chapter is supposed to be one word or one topic of discussion. And many, not all, but many of these topics are described as the combining of two things that seem not to go together, that seem not to fit together. So, for example, there's a discussion of combining the idea that God is visible and God is not visible, or that we could see God and we can't see God. So, and you could also find things like that God is responsible for everything, but yet God is not evil. God does not bring about evil in a responsible way. So all of these kind of, God is responsible for light. Light requires darkness, but God is not responsible for darkness. In what sense? So in all of these discussions of the Urfa and philosophers, there's an attempt made to say, well, there's a sense in which the first statement is true, and then there's another sense in which it can be false. And if we clarify the precise meanings that we have when these kind of statements are issued, we can come to a deeper understanding of God. But it's always done in such a way that the paradoxical nature of the statements, of the original statements, is retained, because that's the whole idea of it. I mean, the whole purpose of having paradoxical statements like this is to spur people to try to investigate more and understand at a deeper level the issues involved. With respect to the Akhbari and Usuli school, and I don't have anything prepared on on this topic, so I can't help you very much with this. I mean, it's a good topic. I'm sure you know more than I that in Qom today, of course, the Usuli approach is dominant. In the Safavid period, Akhbari was much more dominant, even in people like Faiz Kashani. With respect to issues of jurisprudence, there was a tendency towards Akhbari point of view. And here it seems to me that this we find a kind of contradiction in their thinking, because on the one hand, they were drawn towards rationalism with respect to theological issues, but with respect to principles of law, they wanted to rely only on direct quotations from hadiths, and eventually this gave way to Usuli tendencies.
Thank you very much for your answer. I think your explanation is very clear and helpful about pantheism and panentheism, which are not compatible with the unity of God, or wahdatul wujud. I just want to clarify, get your confirmation. Is it true, my opinion on this regard? I read David McClellan theological process in reference to Whitehead process and philosophy, process and reality. In my opinion, he tries to make distance from natural theology, and he tries to establish what they call theology of nature rather than natural theology. But the problem, in my opinion, this is my interpretation, is that because his ontological system is still in the perspective Aristotelian, the meaning of substance, the meaning of being, so he cannot escape from this scheme. So, it is something that how to say it? Something cannot be removed. I mean, it is something unavoidable for him to establish new system of theology.
Who is this?
David McClellan. In reference to Whitehead process and reality.
Yeah.
In my opinion, even though Whitehead criticized strongly the concept of substance in Aristotle, but he still followed the meaning of being in our ontis, the whatness, being, existence, in reference to Aristotle. Mm-hmm. It is, in my opinion, in my interpretation, this is one factor why they cannot come to the real, the new system of theology. I mean, something existential, like in Mullah Sadra. What do you think?
One of the differences between Western tradition of theology of God and the Shiite tradition has to do specifically with this idea of substance. Ibn Sina very explicitly denies that God is a substance. God is not a substance. Why not? Because substance is part of the 10 Aristotelian categories, and the categories only describe quiddity. But God is that which is necessary of existence. So God has no quiddity other than his existence. So God stands outside the notion of substance. Now, Ibn Sina, at some point, he says that, well, of course, if by substance you just mean something that doesn't depend on something else, is independent, then we could say that God is a substance too in that sense. But in the sense of belonging to the category of substance, as in Aristotle, of a primary substance, that is, a particular thing that's the bearer of accidents, this is denied. And I think that this feature, you can find it in Christian tradition as well, and there are allusions to this kind of idea in some of the writings of Aquinas, who maybe more than others were influenced by Avicenna's idea. But it's not developed further. And most of the philosophers in the West, or theologians in the West now, if they want to challenge the idea that God's a substance, they're looking at terms like process and things like this. But in the Islamic tradition, we have right from the time of Ibn Sina and forward that, no, God's not a substance. So that tradition of denial of the substance of God takes on a life of its own.
I have a quick question. Could you please re-explain, you briefly mentioned Tawheed of actions.
Tawheed of actions. Sure. Tawheed of action. This is to mean that everything that happens because of divine will. Now that led to a kind of paradoxical situation in which a person does something wrong, and he says, well, it's God's will. I stole your money. Don't blame me. It's God. And so the idea was that some people reacted to this kind of thing by saying, no, God gives away his power to the human being. So God's not responsible at all. He's not the causal agent of your action. And in the Shia tradition, there was an attempt to deny both of these extremes. On the one hand, the extreme of saying that the action belongs to God, so God's responsible for it. On the other hand, that no, God didn't cause the action. Yeah, something like this. So, but in the Shia tradition, there's hadith that's riwayat that's attributed to Imam Sadiq, that he says not determinism and not libertarianism, or not handing over the control to the human being, but it's an amr bain amrain, something in between these two. And then the further development of Shiite theology consists in saying, well, in what sense something in between these two? So what you find is it's a kind of compatibilism. I mean, if you want to divide positions on free will and determinism into determinist and libertarian and compatibilist, there's a kind of compatibilist. So God is the cause of all actions. Even the action of my sinning has a divine cause, but there's no responsibility. The causal chain does not transmit responsibility. Responsibility because the causal chain goes through the free choice of the agent, and then the responsibility occurs to the one who, by his free choice, commits that sin or whatever it is.
Can it be viewed kind of a microscopic and micro and macroscopic kind of way of viewing at actions?
Yeah.
So microscopically, God's that causes it, but microscopically, we're individually. So it's kind of this paradox, basically. I mean.
Yeah, but individually, what you have is that when we say that somebody is responsible for something, means what? That they're subject to praise and blame for performing the action. And the individual person is subject to blame and praise because he does something that's voluntary. So it's something voluntary means it occurs through his choice. But ontologically speaking, everything has an ultimate cause in God. But the ultimate cause in God doesn't confer any kind of legal responsibility to the previous causal factors.
Can I just ask a question? You mentioned something about the Quranic when you were talking about the concepts of God in Shiite traditions. You mentioned the Quranic understanding through expression, illusion, subtlety, and reality. And I didn't get down who you were quoting, or was this a general concept?
I mentioned Imam Jafar. Good, you remember better than I do. I don't recall exactly. When I was talking about the Quran.
Yeah, the concepts of God in Shia traditions. No, initially you said you spoke about the Quranic teachings on the nature of God, and then you went on to say the Quranic understanding according to someone, and I didn't get the name.
Sheikh Saduk?
Yes, it could be. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, that was easy.
Thank you.
Sorry, this would be the last question because we have to go, yeah?
Okay, now you've been drawing these parallels based on the Western tradition of theology. I'm someone who comes from the East Orthodox world, so I'm curious to know, do you find in the Shia theology something that's very important for the Orthodox theology, which is the distinction between the divine essence and energies, the theology of essence and energies? Something, because it's quite different from what you mean when you discuss the themistic perspective.
Right. I have to confess ignorance of the Orthodox tradition, and I'm not sure how the Orthodox are understanding.
Well, the main
energies.
point would be that there is a teaching that even God's essence is incomprehensible, but He can be simultaneously fully present in His energies. It's a Neoplatonic, basically development of a Neoplatonic framework.
Now I feel at home. See, as soon as if we could go back to Neoplatonic ideas.
And then the key author would be Dionysius, the Areopagites, and then Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century.
Right. The Islamic theology and philosophy also drew on Neoplatonic tradition to a large extent. But the way that it was developed is different than what happened in Christianity, because in Christianity the various hypostases from the Neoplatonists were treated as being within God somehow. So there's this essence of God, which is the unknowable, and then you have different kind of hypostases, which is still somehow either energies or persons or something else from God. But in Islamic tradition, God is restricted just to the essence. And all of the hypostases become creatures of God. So the Logos, for example, you can find Logos in Islamic theology as well, but as the first creature that God created. So all of the hypostases become creatures. In Islamic philosophy, this became the doctrine of the uqul, or the intellect.